Hi everyone, welcome to today's lecture. We're starting our unit on small group communication, and specifically this week we're going to be talking a lot about conflict within small groups. So there's one thing that I know about small group communication and teaching it within classes, and that is that most people do not like small group communication. More often than not, when this unit comes up in my communication classes, students kind of moan and groan. Especially when I try to assign group projects, students really kind of revolt and want to avoid doing this. Now, with all that being said, here's another thing I know, that study after study suggests that employers are looking for employees who can work in small groups. In fact, every year the NACE, National Association of Colleges and Employers, does a survey and asks employers to identify the top skills they're looking for in their employees. And every year, ability to work in a team structure is number one, or at least within the top three. So we've really kind of got a disconnect here, right? In general, people have a generally negative attitude towards small group work and communicating in groups. Yet on the other hand, we know it's a very important and valuable skill. So hopefully some of the material we can discuss today and in our upcoming modules will help us sort through some of these issues and maybe help you feel better prepared as you continue to inevitably work in small groups in your jobs. So we'll just simply start with a definition of conflict, right? Knowing that groups inevitably will experience conflict, let's just kind of talk about and make sure we're all kind of on the same page here regarding what we're talking about with conflict. Right. So I've given you a couple of different definitions here, right? The first one just suggests that conflict is a process where individuals perceive a disagreement about goals, rules, roles, culture, or simply the pattern of how they communicate. One thing that you should notice from this definition that is also in the next definition is that word perceive. We're going to talk about perception a lot today, right? It is really a key component of conflict. So you can see in the next definition there, this is probably my favorite definition. Here we see conflict is defined as a struggle between or among at least two interdependent parties who perceive, again, we've got that word, incompatible goals, scarce resources, and interference from the other. Certainly, we can probably all think of several examples where we've been in a work environment, we've been working with our colleagues, and the perception of incompatible goals, scarce resources, and interference from others has come up. Right? This has probably only been magnified by our work here recently throughout the pandemic. No doubt, goals have become more and more ambiguous. Certainly, resources have been more limited, right? Introducing the idea of working virtually has probably also created quite a bit of interference as you've been trying to accomplish goals. So thinking about conflict in this way hopefully gets us kind of thinking about some of our experiences and exactly what we're going to be talking about throughout this lecture. Okay, so on this slide, I want to spend a little more time talking about the relationship between perception and conflict. And I really have three key ideas that I'd like to share. Beginning with the idea that, first, conflict exists simply because people perceive a conflict. Right? So conflict is not exactly something that's like tangible, or usually it's not something that we can actually reach out and we can touch. Right? But simply when people perceive incompatible goals, resources, or interference, that's enough to create a feeling of conflict. And that's actually why I have the oranges on this slide. Right? I have a story that I really like to share that demonstrates this idea that just the sheer perception of conflict is enough to feel like a conflict exists. So let me share this story with you, right? Imagine we have a situation where we have two sisters and we only have one orange. Right? We've got a conflict here. There's not enough oranges for both sisters. When I share the story in class, the first thing I usually do then is ask, well, so what do the sisters do about this? And inevitably, the response I always get first is, well, the sisters should compromise, right? The sisters should cut the orange in half, and then each sister would get half the orange. Okay, well, that's all well and good, except if we actually continue the story and learn a little bit more about each sister, what we find out is one sister really does want the orange to be able to eat out the inside and to eat the slices of the orange. But the other sister just needs the orange's rind. She's trying to make a cake and she just needs the orange rind for the recipe. So as it turns out, there really was no conflict. Right? Each sister could have gotten exactly what she wanted if we had known the reasons why she wanted the orange. The first sister could have eaten the inside. The second sister could have gotten the rind and used it for her baking. Right? But the fact that the sisters thought they had incompatible goals and a scarce resource here was enough in and of itself to make it feel like the conflict existed. If you think about it in your everyday life, often this is exactly where conflicts come from. So this is probably a good time to kind of remind ourselves of some of the things we've talked about earlier in this semester, right? If you remember, you guys worked on an exercise related to perception checking. And this is a good time to kind of think back about that. Sometimes just engaging in the act of perception checking can kind of help us to eliminate conflicts before they really escalate. All right, so that was my first message, from this slide. Conflicts exist simply if people perceive a conflict exists. Next, I want to point out that often conflicts arise because people simply have different perceptions of the very same event. Again, I think we can connect some dots here from material we've discussed previously in the class. In this particular case, I think there's a great link between today's topic and, if you'll recall, attribution theory. Remember how attribution theory was all about the fact that humans tend to make assumptions for the reasons why people act the way they act, right? And also remember the theory argues we usually are a lot more beneficial and kind to ourselves than to others. When others make a mistake, we tend to assume it's an internal attribution. Remember that term? It's the idea that it's their fault. They caused the mistake. But when we make a mistake, we tend to assume it's due to some kind of external attribution. It was something about the environment or the context that made us make that mistake. So it stands to reason that if we're constantly making these attributions and we're constantly kind of committing this fundamental attribution error, there's a lot of potential for people to have very different perceptions regarding the same circumstance, right, the same event. So just the sheer fact that people have different perceptions of the same event in and of itself can create conflict. Third, the final kind of takeaway message here from this slide regarding perception and conflict is that our perceptions about what the conflict is about is usually not really what the conflict is about. I know that probably sounds kind of meta or kind of existential, but let me just say that one more time and then maybe give some examples. Again, our perception of what a conflict is about is usually not what the conflict is actually about. So what often happens, let's say you're at a work environment here and a conflict starts to arise, and the conflict is about something like a deadline or when a report needs to be submitted. Or maybe it feels like the conflict is about a budget issue and how much money should be spent or not spent. So we tend to have conflicts about those types of topic or content types of issues. But when we dig a little deeper, often what we find out is that those are really just kind of subsequent issues. Underlying those issues more often than not is where the real conflict is. Conflicts are often more about relational issues than content or topics. And what I mean by that is usually people are asking themselves questions about, well, why does she think she gets to be in charge? Or who does he think he is? Why does he have the power? Or those types of things. But those things are really hard to talk about, right? Relational issues, personal issues, what do you mean to me? What do I mean to you? Those are very difficult topics. So instead, they tend to kind of come out and kind of manifest themselves more like content or topic type of conflicts. Right? So again, this can really take us back to our perception checking unit and think a little bit more about what might really be underlying certain attitudes, values, or beliefs. Okay, but no doubt, again, perception and conflict are certainly intertwined and very interwoven, and something we should be aware of. Okay, with that being said, I want to move on to the next slide here that just is really trying to point out the idea that we tend to, over time, develop habits and preferences that lead us to rely on certain conflict styles. right? So whether it's the way we grew up or our family environment, whether it has more to do with our cultural background, being from an individualistic type of society, or a whole host of other personality factors that might be at play. In general, people tend to develop habits or preferences over time about how they handle conflict. All right. As part of this module, I'm asking you to take a survey that helps you to kind of uncover your conflict style. Although my guess is you already kind of have a hunch. Are you an avoider, or are you one who actually really enjoys engaging in conflict? But you can take that survey to kind of help you kind of label what your conflict preference is. Once you identify your conflict preference, you can use this grid to kind of better understand what that looks like in comparison to other people's conflict styles or preferences. When you look at the grid here, you can see that across the two axes, we have the variable of assertiveness, and then we have the variable of cooperativeness. So when we're talking about assertiveness, we're talking about attempts that one uses to satisfy their own concerns. Now, it is important to point out assertiveness and aggressiveness are not the same thing, right? Assertiveness means, standing up for yourself, but not necessarily attacking the other person, right? Along the bottom continuum, you can see we have the term cooperativeness. This is your attempts to satisfy the other person's concerns, right? When you put those two together, you can see that leads us to 5 different conflict styles. I want to take a moment to discuss each style just a little bit. And again, I hope as I'm doing that, you're kind of thinking through where your natural habits are, where your preferences are. Right? I do want to point out that there are not necessarily inherently good or bad conflict styles. I think sometimes some of these styles really get a bad rap. But depending on the relationship between you and the person you're having a conflict with, and depending on the context or the issue that the conflict is about, each one of these styles there might be a time and place for it, right? And there are strengths and weaknesses to each style. So again, I just can't reiterate that enough. There's no one inherently good or one style that should always be used. All right, but with that being said, let's take a closer look. Right? Down here in the left corner, you can see the avoiding style. When you follow along the chart, you see that an avoiding style involves having a low concern for self and meeting your own needs, as well as a low concern for the other person's needs. Right? When I teach some of these styles to my undergraduate students, I usually attach like an animal with each style to help them remember. And the animal that goes along with the avoiding style is the turtle. Right? If you are a turtle, you are someone that sees conflict coming and immediately pulls your head in and says, whoa, I don't want to deal with this. As a result, that means you tend to not get your needs met, but also the other person doesn't necessarily get their needs met either, right? The issue goes unresolved often. If you move up in the chart, you can see we've got the competing style. The competing style is high in assertiveness, high in attempts to get your own needs met, but it's low in cooperativeness or low in desire to meet the other person's needs, right? Again, if we use an animal to think about this style, our competitors are like sharks, is the animal that we usually put there, right? Again, that's not necessarily always a bad thing. If you find yourself in a situation where the relationship between you and the person you're in a conflict with is not important or is not something that's going to be an enduring relationship, perhaps you'll never actually interact with this person again, but whatever the conflict is about is very important to you, then using a competing style might make a lot of sense, right? Sometimes people might argue that if you are attempting to, for example, buy a car and you're working with a car salesman that you never think that you'll work with again, the relationship itself might not be that important between you and that person, but the cost of that car might be crucial to you, then it might make sense that you engage in a very assertive competing style. Okay, if we continue to move around the chart, you can see that we have accommodating as another style. The accommodators are people that tend to be very cooperative and tend to prioritize other people's needs over their own. Right? Accommodating style can be useful in some situations, particularly if the relationship between you and the person you're interacting with is very important. But the issue at hand is really not as big a deal to you, right? I just recently had a situation where I was going in on a group gift with a bunch of friends. We have another friend who is having a baby, and so we all agreed to buy one kind of bigger, more expensive gift by pooling our funds. And it turns out a few of my friends were very committed to a certain item on the registry, and they had very strong opinions about what the gift should be. To be honest, I didn't care. I was willing to chip in, and I want, to help contribute towards the gift, but I don't care what we get our friend that's having the baby. So in that situation, I felt really comfortable engaging in an accommodating style. I didn't necessarily want to upset anyone. I obviously want to maintain great friendship with these people, but I don't really care if we buy a car seat versus, I don't know, whatever the item was on the registry, right? The particular purchase itself wasn't that big a deal to me. So I was happy to engage in accommodating style in that case. All right, we go up to the top there. Well, actually, I want to go to the middle next. The middle style there is compromising. I mentioned earlier that I think a lot of times when you ask someone what is the best way to manage a conflict, compromise is the answer that you get. But you can see here from this chart that that's not necessarily always the case, right? When we compromise, you can see we're kind of in the middle in cooperativeness, and we're also kind of in the middle of assertiveness, which usually means we wind up with some kind of outcome that's like 50-50. Maybe I got a little bit of what I wanted, but I also had to give up some of what I wanted, right? So it's kind of a win-lose situation. In circumstances where you are forced to make a quick decision, there's not a lot of time for discussion or debate, compromise might make a lot of sense, right? Because compromises tend to not always take a lot of time, right? It's a little give and take, and you reach a solution. However, if we move up to the top right-hand corner, we can see that the collaborating style might actually be a situation where it leads to, instead of a 50-50 outcome, more of kind of like a 100% outcome, or a win-win solution, right? Because the collaborating style involves really focusing on your own needs and being assertive and getting your needs met, but also really focusing on the other person's needs and making sure that they get their needs met as well. So a collaborating style really looks like a win-win instead of either party having to give things up. I probably don't have to tell you, right? That can be very challenging, and it can be very time-consuming, and it could require a lot of creativity. And so if there's time, and if the issue is really important, and the relationship is really important, then it's probably worth it. But certainly there are circumstances where it might not be a possibility. Okay, so again, now that we have like a brief definition of each one of those conflict styles and those conflict habits, if you haven't already, I encourage you to make sure to go back and fill out that scale. And also, I encourage you to think about this. This is one of your discussion questions this week. Think a little bit more about your style, and I'll look forward to your responses regarding your style on the discussion page. Okay. Okay, so although we all tend to have our own habits and preferences when it comes to managing conflicts, especially managing conflicts in group settings, I still want to talk about a few kind of really specific behaviors that we can all engage in to help us manage conflict more effectively. So the first thing that I'm going to suggest is that it is important to bring up conflicts, to actually express disagreements. That can be really hard for our avoiders. Sometimes that's just really uncomfortable. And sometimes people with an avoiding style say, I would rather just not even bring it up. And if it's a situation where you can get over it, or it's a situation where it's really not that big of a deal, then that's fine. Maybe the issue does not need to be raised. But it's a situation where you find yourself continually being frustrated, not really able to get over the issue, then it is something that should be brought up. Right? This always reminds me of the old fable, The Princess and the Pea. If you guys are familiar with that or not. But if you are, you know that in theory, this tiny little pea, this little pebble-sized object, shouldn't be a big deal. But if the issue is bothering you, and you've tried to and you can't, it's important to bring it up. You can see on the slide here, I have a couple of ideas of how to do that. Right? Well, my first suggestion is to avoid what a lot of textbooks call gunny sacking. So think of a gunny sack as like a backpack, right? And visualize yourself putting this issue that you're frustrated about here in your backpack, right? And you say, okay, I'm going to put it back there. I'm going to tuck it away and I'm not going to worry about it. But you notice you are worried about it. You're frustrated by it and you can't get over it. And now all of a sudden you notice your backpack is starting to weigh more and more. And it's just really starting to weigh you down. And now all of a sudden it feels like you've got this huge backpack that you're carrying around. That's the epitome of gunny stacking, right? So I hate this word, but it's very descriptive of the term. You want to avoid letting issues fester, right? If you feel yourself not being able to get over an issue, you should bring it up. Now, there's a lot of research that offers tips on how to bring up topics. And one of the most compelling things that I've ever read is the idea that you really want to try to bring up issues using what's called a soft startup. Soft startups involve I statements instead of you statements, right? They're not accusatory, they're not attacking, they're not the verbal representation of the finger wag, right? Soft statements often involve questions rather than declarative statements. They often involve I statements. They hopefully are stated in calm and measured language, not yelling or profanity. Okay. One of my very favorite studies was done by John Gottman, a relational scholar, and what he found when he investigated people engaging in conflict is that he could predict with insane accuracy how a conflict will end just by watching the first 4 minutes of how the conflict began. So what that tells us is the way you bring up a conflict and how you start discussing a difficult topic dramatically influences how the conversation is going to go. Now, I don't tell you that to give you any kind of like analysis paralysis or make you kind of panic and overthink how to bring up a topic, but instead I tell you that to hopefully raise a little bit of awareness and recognize that you really do have a lot of control regarding how difficult conversations can go. Because the way you bring up a topic, like I said, has a dramatic impact on how the conversation is going to go and the outcome that you're going to reach. So if you're struggling with an issue right now, I really encourage you to think through, mentally kind of play in your head how you'd like to bring up the topic and think about doing it in a way that is as soft to start up rather than using some kind of harsh startup. Okay, you can see the next bullet point I have there suggests that it's important when you do bring up a conflict to stick to the issue at hand. Right? Often what we do when we're engaged in a conflict is something called kitchen sinking. Again, it's a little bit of a cheesy term here, but it prevents a really good mental picture, right? I'm sure you've all heard that phrase before, you're throwing everything in but the kitchen sink. And you've also probably all been in that situation before where you're engaged in conflict. The initial conflict had something to do with, I don't know, a conflict over whether or not you should be working virtually or having the meeting in person or something like that. And all of a sudden, by the time the conversation's over, you're talking about 10 other different things, right? That's kitchen sinking. That's throwing everything into the conversation. There's a lot of reasons why kitchen sinking happens, right? The main reason why it happens is when we're in a conflict and we feel like someone is critiquing us, or in some ways being critical of our actions, then it's a human instinct to engage in fight or flight, right? All right, you're going to attack me. You know what I'm going to do back? I'm going to attack you, right? I'm going to get defensive. I'm going to counter blame, and I'm going to reflect the criticism that I feel coming towards me back at you. Right? And so when you get into that kind of game, no wonder all kinds of issues start being discussed, right? But I think we all know that's really unproductive. That rarely leads to the first issue getting solved, let alone all the other issues. So a strategy that can be really effective is something called bracketing, right? If you find yourself sitting in a group meeting and perhaps it's starting to get contentious or just a little bit off track because one person's bringing up an issue and then someone else might be defensive and you've got multiple issues going at once, try the strategy of bracketing. Think about actually, I guess kind of figuratively, getting some brackets and saying, okay, we're going to put brackets around each of these issues. Right? So you are bringing up an issue regarding tardiness, and that's an important issue. We should discuss that issue, but that's not what we're talking about right now. We need to focus on the meeting agenda at this point. Now, that's not to dismiss the new issue. It's not to say, oh, this issue of tardiness isn't important, but bracketing is saying we need to focus on one issue at a time, right? And maybe we'll give this issue the next 10 minutes, but we'll put tardiness as the #1 issue for our next meeting. So it can be easier said than done, but it's a relatively simple strategy to think about. Anytime you feel like you're getting off track, get those brackets out and help yourself stay on track. All right, #3 suggests the importance of using rhetorical sensitivity anytime you're in a group conflict. Rhetorical sensitivity is just a really fancy way to say think before you speak, right? Think about what you're saying. I think one place this is especially important is not just when you're interacting face-to-face, but when you are engaging in emails or communicating through computer-mediated communication. Sometimes there's some anonymity that goes along with being behind a screen, and so it's really easy to fire off heated or flaming emails. But think before you speak. Pause before you type. Right? And another really specific way to think about that is this idea of avoid trigger words. Now, there tend to be some words that are universally triggering for people, that as soon as someone hears that, it kind of reduces their ability to focus to zero and gets them fired up about other things. Right? Of course, profanity is an example of that. I would hope profanity wouldn't necessarily be an issue in a workplace environment, but we know, cuss words can automatically escalate things. Right? But there's another example I think is really important that often gets overlooked, and that is something called an absolute. Absolutes are an example of trigger words. What are absolutes? Two really good examples of absolutes are the words always and never. Right? For example, you might say something like, your work is really never a high enough quality. You always have typos and mistakes. All right, think about what happens if someone tells you something like that and uses the words always and never. My guess is immediately your reaction is to get defensive, is to think of the times when that wasn't true, that you actually turned in really high quality work, right? When you use the words always and never, rarely is that actually accurate. But what that does is that automatically makes people defensive, and it makes people think of situations where, yep, those statements aren't true, right? And so very quickly, you can see how the topic gets off track. Right? So I really encourage you to think about that. I hope after you actually hear this slide today, you'll notice perhaps how often you actually might be using the words always and never, or how people you're interacting with use them on a regular basis. And I think when you just kind of raise your awareness, you'll realize just how, again, inaccurate, but also ineffective those types of words are. Okay. There are plenty of other triggers as well. If we were interacting face-to-face right now, I'd have a chance to ask you what some of your triggers might be. I know when I sometimes talk about this in my classes, I hear people say things like, when texting or when interacting online, putting the period at the end of the sentence can be kind of insulting, right? Or especially if it's like a K period, right? That kind of is a way of minimizing or ending the conversation, and people tend to not respond to that well. Another big one often for people can be simply the phrase, calm down. Right? That really can trigger people. I don't think that phrase ever actually works. And someone actually hears it and thinks, oh, well, calm down, right? Instead, it tends to just upset people. But in general, of course, it's a good idea to really think before you speak, pause before you type, and try to engage in rhetorical sensitivity. Okay, we've got 2 more I want to talk about. The next one is try to disagree with ideas, but avoid criticizing the person, right? So sometimes it can be very easy to attack other individuals. Ugh, you are lazy, right? Or you're a slob, you're disorganized, those types of things. That rarely is effective, right? Because when we feel like we are being personally attacked, I can't say enough, our human reaction is fight or flight, right? To get out of there or to attack back. Also, if you think about it, usually we kind of like ourselves, right? Or at the very least, even if we don't maybe like certain behaviors about ourselves, it's really hard to change who we are, right? And so being told that I need to change, it doesn't feel good. On the other hand, behaviors are much easier to change, right, than actually like who we are, right? We can change our behaviors. So rather than calling someone lazy or a slob or attacking someone personally, focusing on behaviors, feelings, and because statements can be really powerful. So here's an example, right? Rather than saying, you were so inconsiderate, saying something like, when you're on your phone, when I'm trying to talk to you, it makes me feel like you're not really listening. It makes me frustrated because because I want you to be listening, right? Or because you said you had time to talk, right? Behavior, feeling, because. When you do this, it makes me feel this way because. That's such a less threatening way to talk about what might be a difficult issue rather than attacking the person. So those are easier said than done, but really something to kind of think about and something to practice. Okay. And then my final suggestion is, and this is it can be so important, focus on interests rather than positions when you're in a conflict. And this really ties back to some of the things we've discussed earlier in the slide, particularly when it comes to this issue of perception. Right? So just to be clear here, when I'm talking about positions, I'm talking about kind of the line in the sand that we tend to draw and say, this is my stance on the issue. I'm going to pay $5,000 for that car. Well, I'm going to sell the car for $6,000. Right? I need to have my work turned in by Sunday. Well, I need to receive it by Saturday. Right? Those are just positions. Those are kind of lines in the sand. Often they are somewhat arbitrary or set. They may or may not have good reasons, I guess, but we set these positions. Interests, on the other hand, are the reasons behind the positions, right? Why we've come up with certain positions. If we focus on interests rather than positions, we're much more likely to come to win-win solutions or more collaborative outcomes that lead to 100% agreement. Excuse me. Think about our sisters with the orange, right? Had they actually asked each other about their interests, the reason behind why they wanted the orange, they would have come to a 100% solution, right? Oh, I didn't realize you wanted to actually eat the inside of the orange. Oh gosh, I didn't realize you just wanted the rind on the outside of the orange. By figuring out your reasons behind your positions, you dramatically increase the odds of reaching a successful outcome. Right? Again, it takes more time. It takes some creativity. We often don't think about doing this, but it's such a powerful tool as a strategic communicator that you can take advantage of. Okay. Hopefully that gets you really thinking about maybe some conflicts that you've had recently or some ways that you might be able to manage conflicts should they arise here in the near future. A few more things I want to discuss include issues related to power. We know there can be a lot of power dynamics when you're engaged in small groups and group communication as well. So I just want to take you a few minutes to kind of think about this concept of power. I was just starting here on the slide with a definition of power. Ultimately, I'm going to argue that power is synonymous with influence. Right? Power is our ability to achieve a desired goal or outcome by being able to change the behavior, value, or attitude of another person, right? So power involves influencing someone to think differently or to act differently. Excuse me. Okay, so there's a really famous typology that describes different sources of power that was created by French and Raven a few decades ago. And again, I think this is such a powerful way to think about power. And potentially be really strategic about strategies for influence. If you pair some of these ideas with some of the ideas that we talked about earlier in the semester from Cialdini and his lessons on persuasion, I think you really can come up with some really effective strategies here. Okay. So on this slide, what you can see is 5 different types of power. And French and Raven argue that an individual can influence others using all of these different types of power. By thinking a little bit about who you're trying to influence, what you're trying to influence them of, right, and what some of their interests might be, you can really think through what might be the most effective way to have power. So let's talk about each one of these, right? The first one is reward power, and it's pretty straightforward. If someone has reward power, they have the ability to offer an incentive. We can think about a work setting, right? We often think about your salary or a bonus or a raise as a reward that people appreciate, right? And that could be used to incentivize, harder work or more work or what have you, right? Excuse me. So Reward power is the ability to motivate or influence someone based on offering them some type of incentive that they want, right? Now, the key with reward power is it really does only work if the person you're trying to influence actually desires that reward. If they don't care about an extra salary, or they don't care about vacation days, or whatever other incentive you're able to offer, then this is probably not going to be a very useful source of power. Another thing about reward power is it tends to only change behaviors in the short term, but it really doesn't tend to get buy-in or long-term changes in beliefs, right? A person may engage in a certain behavior because they want that quick incentive, but it's not like you actually change the reasoning or the belief behind a behavior if you're simply using reward power. That's pretty similar to coercive power. We get kind of the same results when we use coercive power. Coercive power is the ability to punish or to threaten a punishment, right? It's kind of the other side of the reward coin, right? People can be motivated by a fear of punishment, right? If I do not want to get fired, or if I do not want to lose some of my benefits, then I might, act in a certain way to avoid that type of punishment. But again, it's not that you're convincing me that I should be acting a certain way. It's just that you're motivating me in order to avoid a punishment. But certainly there can be situations where reward power and coercive power might be effective. Legitimate power can be used in groups. When you try to use legitimate power in a group, what you're usually doing is saying, I have power based on my position, right? So I'm the boss, listen to me. Right? Because I hold this particular role or have this certain title, then with that comes power, right? Again, this doesn't necessarily grant buy-in or belief from the people who are below you in that position, but it can at least potentially change beliefs or can influence in the short term. As we continue to work our way down here, we tend to find these two as being much more effective strategies if you need not just compliance, but you need buy-in. Okay? So let's look at expert power. Expert power is when people try to influence based on providing additional knowledge or information. Right? So if I have done some research, or maybe I have not done the research myself, but I've read research, and I present you with those findings, that's an attempt to use expert power, right? One thing I do a lot in my classes is we talk about multitasking, and we talk about how ineffective multitasking is. That we all think we're good at multitasking, but the reality is our brain doesn't work that way. Our brains just can't process information effectively when we're trying to do a whole bunch of things at once. Right? So a lot of times what this boils down to is, as the instructor, my request of students not to be on their cell phones during class. So I can tell my students, don't be on your cell phones. I can even say, listen, I'm going to punish you if you're on your cell phones. I'm going to take away points. But what I find is the one strategy that works the best is actually sharing information with them regarding studies that shows a clear link between being on cell phones during class and trying to multitask and a drop in academic performance. Right? And what sometimes even works better than that is showing them a study that finds it's not just when you yourself are on a cell phone during class, but if you are sitting next to someone who is on their cell phone or a laptop during class, just being a bystander dramatically drops your grade performance. Right? Actually sharing that information, actually sharing that knowledge tends to be influential, right? And changes not just the immediate behavior or compliance, but actually gets people thinking and kind of buying into what I want them to believe in, right? The idea, in this case, to not use a cell phone during class. Okay, so that's what expert power is. And then finally, in certain circumstances, what can be the most effective source of power is referent power. Referent power is power based on liking or respect. To me, one of the most classic examples of this, and I think a lot of you can relate because I know many of you have referred to being athletes, it's the idea that when you're on the team and you love and respect your coach, you would do anything not to disappoint them, right? If that's the case, if you've had that feeling before, your coach has referent power, right? You are acting in a way in order to not disappoint that person. right? And so that's an example. That's an example of referent power. We know the use of celebrities in marketing and advertising campaigns is also an example of referent power, right? Usually that celebrity is not an expert on whatever they're trying to sell, right? In fact, I tend to kind of chuckle when I see professional athletes advertising for fast food companies. You know that they haven't eaten that fast food, that junk, in years. But the fast food restaurant is banking on the fact that as a public, we want to do what that person or that celebrity is telling us to do, right? Because we like that celebrity. So they're basing on this idea of referent power. So if we kind of summarize that all up here in a couple of key takeaway ideas, right? When it comes to power and when it comes to trying to kind of influence people within your group setting, one thing we know is, right, power and conflict are based on perception, right? Taking and giving of power, it's all about a relationship, right? A leader can't just stand up there and say, I have power, right? Instead, a follower has to grant the leader power, right? So no doubt, power is based on the relationship between the leader and the follower. Okay, the second takeaway message is the idea that, at best, those kind of initial sources of power we talked about, coercive power, reward power, even legitimate power, can get compliance, can get short-term changes in behaviors and values, but they do not get long-term changes in beliefs or behaviors. What does get that, on the other hand, is change by attraction, right? Creating a sense of liking and respect. Using referent power has the opposite effect, right? When you're engaged in reference power and everyone buys in, then resistance fades because there's nothing to kind of push back on, right? There's no coercion, and then people tend to be motivated to move forward by choice, right, rather than by fear of the punishment, right? Okay, at this point, I better kind of wrap things up here. Hopefully, I've introduced some interesting ideas regarding small group communication, and specifically regarding issues of conflict and issues of power. As always, if you have any questions as you work through this module, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know. All right, thanks.